Hello everyone, I hope you're all fine. My name is Abdul Wahab and I will be presenting the paper Finding Syntax in Human Encephalography with Beam Search. I am presenting this paper with my friend Mohammad Kamran Janjua. This is the outline that we will be following throughout this presentation. In the first part of this presentation, I will be giving you an introduction to the paper, explaining the main idea and the goal, the motivation of this research. I will then talk about the previous related work in this area and how it relates to the paper. Then I will talk about the proposed methodology, which is a syntactic parsing model composed of two parts, RNNGs and beam search. Then Kamran will explain complexity metrics, datasets, models, experiments, results, and conclusion. So this paper was published in ACL Conference 2018. ACL is an A-star conference in computational linguistics. It has an impact score of 10.56 and an H5 index of 0.35. All the figures that we have used in this presentation are from the paper and from the oral presentation given at the conference. All other images that we have used, we have cited them properly. So, in the past 2 weeks, we have had paper presentations which focused on the semantics of a language and its relation to the brain to study different downstream tasks like encoding. In this paper, the main focus is on syntactic representations and how they correlate with the brain. The motivation behind this work was to see if syntactical information is processed in the brain while processing language. The computational linguistic model gives us insights at psycholinguistic processes that undergo inside the human brain when processing language. To develop cognitively plausible parsing model is one of the main motivation of this research. The authors propose a syntactic computational linguistic model for language generation and evaluate it to see if it is cognitively plausible. Cognitively plausible means that a model does something similar to what the human brain does. In this section, I will give you a brief overview of what the authors do in this paper to find the correlation between the syntactic parsing model and the brain data, that is EEG. So on the left-hand side of the figure on the screen, you can see that there are different states corresponding to different words. These are the internal representations of the parsing model, and each internal state corresponds to a specific word. On the right-hand side, we have the EEG signal that also corresponds to that similar word. So finding the correlation between the internal representations and EEG signal would give us a good correlation between and tell us if syntactical representations or if the internal representations of the syntactical model is related to what the brain does. This correlation is computed by using the internal representations as regressors against EEG to predict the behavior. This predicted behavior shows an early peak and a later P600 peak. The P600 peak is an event-related potential component, or a peak in electrical brain activity measured by EEG. This peak is generated in response to hearing or reading grammatical errors and other syntactic anomalies. It is well accepted in the linguistic community that P600 corresponds to the syntactical processing of the language inside the human brain. The authors also performed similar analysis using a non-syntactical computational linguistic model. In this case, no significant or reliable results were produced, which this further strengthens the point that the brain does in fact make use of hierarchical structure while processing language. There has been a lot of work in computational psycholinguistics, and it is an important tool for understanding the psycholinguistics, which are the phenomena that undergo inside the human brain while processing language. Computational psycholinguistics provide us insight to the phenomena that are happening inside the human brain. Martin Kay, in his ACL Lifetime Achievement Award, A Life of Language, says that computational psycholinguistics has always been the thing that computational linguistics stood the greatest chance of providing to the humanity. In the paper Cognitively Plausible Models for Human Language Processing, the authors Frank Keller identify the current challenges in developing cognitively plausible computational linguistic models. He also discusses the importance of computational models, arguing that they allow us to test hypotheses about the cognitive processes that undergo inside the human brain. Keller also suggests that a promising place to look for insights relating to human sentence processing is at the intersection of A. Incremental processing, B. Prod coverage, and C. Neural signals from the human brain. The authors of the current paper that we are discussing also follow a similar approach for their analysis. In the paper, Abstract Linguistic Structures Correlates with Temporal Activity During Naturalistic Comprehension, the authors study whether the brain activity shows computations over hierarchical grammar, or does it only consider semantic information and processes language in a linear order. The author also identify which regions in the brain, if at all, deal with such abstract hierarchical representations. The authors use different parsing models, that is, either syntactic parsing model or a non-syntactic parsing model, to find the correlation between these different models and the measured brain activity. They use complexity metrics drawn from each of the model as regressor against fMRI readings in regions that show activity in sentence comprehension. This is a very similar approach to what the authors are doing in the main paper that I am presenting. One key difference is the brain activity data that they're using, that is fMRI versus EEG. The authors compared the regions identified by the proposed approach using previously proposed approaches. One such common approach is to vary whether syntactical structure is present or not by comparing phrases or sentences with list of words. Since there is a hierarchical structure in the sentence and none in individual words, observing and comparing the activity in different regions can identify those specific regions that are responsible for syntactic processing. The identified regions for syntactical processing using the proposed approach were consistent with the previous studies about such regions. The authors found support for abstract hierarchical structures in the left anterior and posterior temporal lobe. For non-syntactical parsing models, the identified correlated regions were the inferior frontal gyrus, the anterior temporal lobe, and the left posterior temporal lobe. The results show that although semantic information processing is more widespread across the brain-language network, but there are certain areas uh, that is left temporal lobe where the hierarchical representations and are processed along with semantic representations. In the paper deriving lexical and syntactic expectations-based measures for psycholinguistic modeling via incremental top-down parsing, the authors present a novel method to extract separate lexical and syntactical complexity metrics like surprisal and entropy from a fully lexicalized incremental top-down parser. This approach was different from the previously proposed methods that used two different models, that is, a lexicalized parser and an unlexicalized parser for getting the separate metrics. The author used their proposed methods to draw these separate complexity metrics and find their correlation with the human reading time. The authors observed that the new metrics, specifically syntactic surprisal and syntactic entropy, have high utility for modeling human reading time data. Evaluating the previously proposed methods that also get separate metrics showed no significant results for this type of modeling. In the paper, Incremental Predictive Parsing with Psycholinguistically Motivated Tree Adjoining Grammar, the authors argue that the key properties for human sentence processing are incrementality, connectedness, that is, partial structures contains no unconnected nodes, and predicting, which is anticipating the upcoming syntactic structure. You will note that this is very similar to what Keller proposed as well for human sentence processing. The authors proposed the first broad coverage parser for psycholinguistically motivated tree adjoining grammar that incorporates all these three properties. The proposed methodology was used to predict the human reading times, showing a better fit on Dundee eye tracking corpus than a standard surprisal model. Asaf, in his PhD thesis, Imaging Neural Correlates of Syntactic Complexity in a Naturalistic Context, used a probabilistic parser to draw a number of complexity metrics like surprisal, syntactic complexity, structural ambiguity, disambiguation, etc. He then performed detailed psycholinguistic analysis correlating these metrics with the observed brain activity of MRI data to identify the different brain networks that support linguistic processing and characterize their particular function. Finally, the paper that is discussed the most in this paper is the ERP response to the amount of information conveyed by words in sentences. In this paper, the authors extend the idea of using complexity metrics for the prediction of reading time on words, which is basically a method for psycholinguistic evaluation. They instead use complexity metrics for the prediction of different ERPs in the EEG data. The authors use three different types of models for evaluation. Markov models, which estimates probability based on previous n-1 words. RNNs, which take sequence of words as input. And PSGs, which are probabilistic phrase structure grammar. And it is the only syntactical model that they have used. The complexity metrics surprisal and entropy drawn from these models was used as regressors against the collected EEG. The authors observed a correlation between surprisal and the N400 ERP. In all the models, the authors also observed that using a non-syntactical model resulted in a better fit to the EEG data compared to a syntactical model like PSG. The author also observed no correlation between surprisal and the P600 ERP, making them conclude that the syntactic processing plays no central role and that the reader makes no use of hierarchical sentence structure for generating expectations about the upcoming word. The authors of the paper that I am presenting do not agree with these conclusions, and thus they use a syntactical linguistic model, RNNG plus beam search, to find the correlation between the complexity metrics drawn from this model to the P600 ERP in the EEG. I will now talk about the computational linguistic model proposed in this paper for the task of generating language. The proposed model is an incremental parsing model which is composed of two parts: a probabilistic generative grammar, RNNGs, for generating derivational actions and trees corresponding to those actions, and a beam search algorithm that maintains a beam of parser states. I will talk about the details of these individual modules one by one and discuss how they are used in combination. RNNGs were first proposed in a paper of ACL 2016 conference called Recurrent Neural Network Grammars. RNNGs are probabilistic models that generate trees, and they are history-based grammars that is That means that the probability of a tree is discomposed by the chain rule in terms of derivational action that is further conditioned on previous derivational actions. At each step, the RNNG model chooses a derivational action and maintains a tree describing the syntactical structure of the data observed so far and the corresponding derivational action. The RNNG follows a depth-first traversal for developing the phase structure tree, meaning that the children are announced bottom-up, one by one, as they are completed. All the words and phrase structures observed so far are neurally represented inside the stack. The stack is the gray area in the figure that you can see on the screen. At each stage of the derivation, a single vector summarizes the entire state of the stack, which is the middle rectangle. This sequential model is implemented using stack LSTMs, which were used in the paper Transition-Based Dependency Parsing with Stack LSTMs. The RNNG's model used in this paper is essentially different from the originally proposed RNNG model. Now, this difference is of key importance because RNNG model is used as a parsing model and is used as an incremental parsing model in this proposed approach. So therefore, the look ahead buffer is removed. This is important for incremental parsing. At each stage of the derivation, the RNNG can take three decisions. By using the state summary vector as input to an MLP, which is a multi-layer perceptron, the MLP predicts whether to generate a word, end a phrase, or start a new phrase. These are the three actions that an RNNG can take at any point. If the RNNG decides to open a new constituent or to generate a word, these probabilities are the summary vector is then again used as input to two independent MLPs, which predict the specific non-terminal to open. And in case of generating a word, there is a separate MLP that predicts which specific word to generate. In case of closing the derivational action, a syntactic composition function is engaged. The reason why a syntactic composition function is engaged is because the constituent is now complete, and now this can be represented by a single vector. This is done by squeezing the subtrees into one single vector by applying bidirectional LSTMs to children prepended with the mother category. The parameters of all these components are updated using backpropagation at training time, minimizing the cross entropy relative to a corpus of tree. In this section, I will talk about the beam search algorithm and why it is important. Let us revise that a probabilistic grammar like RNNGs generate word strings and also a tree. So thus, they are a joint model of these two aspects. On the other hand, a parser is a simple program that infers a good tree by observing its word string. There can be a number of different trees that can be derived. Thus, there is a demand for a parsing mechanism or a program that can identify the better tree based on the observable string or word string. The process of selecting a derivational action becomes more challenging in an incremental setting because of the added ambiguity in case of incremental parsing. Since we said that the RNNG model that we are using and is an incremental parsing model, we have to deal with this added ambiguity. This means that an action that might seem to be reasonable at one point might end up looking foolish at a later point. Beam search addresses this issue by keeping a beam of multiple parser states at each point. Each parser state is scored inside the beam by calculating the negative log likelihood of the probability assigned by the RNG model to that state. This beam of parser states allow the linguistic model to deal with temporary ambiguity. For example, if at some point the score of a parser state goes down by observing some word later on, there still might be other states in the beam that are not so drastically affected. This idea is called rank parallelism, and it has become central to psycholinguistic modeling. Another issue with beam search is that is very crucial is the imbalance between the probabilities of structural and lexical actions. The imbalance occurs because a generative parser defines a joint probability over sentences and parse trees. Thus, the probability mass is allocated unevenly between a small number of common structural actions and a large number vocabulary of lexical items. The result of this imbalance is that the lexical actions that actually derive the analysis to the next word are assigned such low probability compared to structural actions that they are never selected. This causes the generative model to keep taking structural actions, adding more and more structure to the sentence rather than actually proceeding forward with a word. To address this issue of imbalance, the authors of Effective Inference for Generating Neural Parsing proposed a word-synchronous beam search algorithm. This algorithm keeps on deriving structural actions until enough lexical actions are observed from high-scoring parser states. The algorithm one shown in the slide works by taking the input beam as this word, followed by a while loop that keeps on searching for lexical actions while they are still less than the required beam size. Inside the while loop, all the parser states in the beam are further explored by taking the derivational action in those states. Then we select only the top k new states by pruning the rest of them. Then using the for loop over the new states, we check if arriving at a new state was a result of taking a lexical action. If yes, then this state is added to the next word, which is the list of selected lexical actions. If not, then this state must be a result of taking a structural action. All such states are added to this word, and now these new states are further explored to search for more lexical actions. Uh, Finally, once we have enough lexical actions derived from many structural actions, we again prune the next word to get the top k word lexical actions. This beam is called the word beam, and the threshold k word is usually equal to k, which is the action beam size, divided by 10. This word beam is handed off to the next instance of the algorithm. As you might be able to tell that this while loop can run for many iterations till enough high-scoring parser states are observed that derive lexical actions. The authors of the algorithm have also proposed an optimization of this algorithm called fast tracking. In fast tracking, some lexical words are directly moved to the next word. The above-mentioned beam search algorithm maintains different parser states in the beam and makes the proposed model robust to temporary ambiguity. The RNNG plus beam search, when combined, uh, becomes a very robust generative incremental parsing model, uh, which handles and caters for temporary ambiguity, uh, and also the imbalance in the uh, in in the sense of structural and lexical actions. In this table, uh, the authors show the Penn treebank accuracies for RNG plus beam search. It can be seen that above k is equal to 200, the combination of RNNG and beam search outperforms a conditional model based on the greedy decoding. In the next part, Kamran Janjua will explain how complexity metrics can be uh, drawn from the algorithm 1, uh, and how they represent internal representations of the computational linguistic model proposed. And later he will explain in the results how uh, these syntactical representations relate with the human brain data, that is EEG. Also, comparisons with he will talk about the comparisons with non-syntactical linguistic models that do not generate such response. Okay, thank you.